Horror movies, especially slasher flicks, often leave the identity of the villain unknown for most of the film, and this is sometimes a very good thing since it keeps viewers guessing and, if done right, leads to an entertaining reveal. At the same time, the device of an unknown villain can be a double-edged sword in that a poor choice of killer, such as someone who couldn't plausibly have done the killings or a random character audiences have no emotional connection to, can undermine or even outright break the entire movie. It's never a good feeling when one spends an entire horror film waiting for the big reveal, only for it to fall entirely flat. So with that in mind, and with a very croaky voice, I'm Ellie for What Culture, here with horror movies with the worst reveals. Identity, Timmy. Identity, a criminally underrated horror movie, depicts 10 strangers being hunted down one by an unknown murderer at an isolated motel. It features a very memorable plot twist in which it turns out that the characters in the film are actually all separate personalities inside the mind of a killer. It's better than it sounds. Anyhow, one of the personalities, the killer's murderous personality, is killing all the other personalities, and it's revealed at the very end to be Timmy, the personality who was a 9-year-old boy and who appeared to have been murdered earlier on, but had in fact staged his death. The movie overall works, but Timmy wasn't the best choice for the killer. Having a little boy as the big bad just felt a bit too silly, and given that the film is so full of outlandish plot twists, this final twist felt like one too many. Having one of the adult characters as the killer would have been far better, especially since Timmy wasn't one of the film's bigger characters, and having a major character as the surprise villain is always better. Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, Roy Burns. This highly underappreciated installment of the Friday the 13th franchise did make the wise choice of ditching Jason Voorhees and having another killer instead. But while the film largely works, it could have chosen its killer better. The murderer turns out to be Roy Burns, some random paramedic who appeared briefly earlier on to collect the body of Joey, who is living at the residential treatment facility where the film is set. Joey had been killed by one of the other patients. Roy then dressed up as the deceased Jason Voorhees and went on the rampage against the facility's other patients. It is revealed after Roy is killed that Joey was Roy's son, and that Roy blamed those at the facility for Joey's death. It was sensible to introduce a new killer, as Jason was already getting a bit stale by this point. But Roy wasn't the right choice. He was only a minor character, and viewers will have forgotten about him right up until the ending, meaning this reveal carried no weight. Unfortunately, thanks to the film's weak reception, Jason was resurrected for the remaining sequels. Saw 3D, Dr. Lawrence Gordon. While Mark Hoffman is the killer for most of this atrocious installment in the Saw franchise, Dr. Lawrence Gordon from the original movie is revealed to be another one of Jigsaw's apprentices in a final twist. He then proceeds to kill Hoffman as a punishment for murdering Jill Tuck, Jigsaw's ex-wife. This was a terrible final reveal which fell flat for two main reasons. Firstly, everyone guessed that Gordon would be a new apprentice as soon as Carrie Elwes was announced to be returning, so this was a painfully obvious plot twist. And secondly, it doesn't make a hint of sense. Why on earth would Gordon happily join forces with the man who nearly killed him and tried to murder his wife and daughter? He wasn't the most sympathetic character in the original movie, but nothing hinted he'd turn out to be psychopath material. It would have been far better to bring Gordon back in a heroic role, seeking revenge against Jigsaw and his apprentices, or something along those lines. It certainly would have made a lot more sense and been considerably more interesting. Black Christmas, Agnes. This ghastly remake of the terrific early slasher film Black Christmas makes many huge mistakes. One of the biggest is giving the killer, who was entirely unseen in the original, an unnecessary backstory about an abusive, incestuous family. That was bad enough, but throwing in a completely pointless second killer made it all even worse. As well as the main murderer, Billy, his sister/daughter Agnes is also killing off a group of luckless sorority girls. With slasher films, it is generally better just to have one killer, as two or more murderers tends to feel like an overload, which was certainly the case here. Agnes is also not only a thoroughly cliched and dull villain, but all the stuff about incest was just too much and veered right into shock for shock's sake territory. The right approach would have been to firstly just have Billy doing the murders, and secondly not give him any backstory at all. That's part of what made other killers like the original's unidentified killer and Michael Myers work so well. Happy Death Day to You, Gregory Butler. While Happy Death Day was a horror comedy, Happy Death Day 2U, the highly unsuccessful sequel, was more of a science fiction film, and the masked killer faded into irrelevance. Still, there was a big reveal at the end, and it sucked hard. In the original, protagonist Tree's roommate Laurie was the killer, which was a far better twist, who repeatedly murdered Tree in the time loop she was trapped in. But this movie takes place in an alternative dimension, with another time loop in which someone else is trying to kill Tree, Dr. Gregory Butler. Butler was the professor Tree was having an affair with in the first film, and this motivated a jealous Laurie to kill her, while in this reality Butler is going after Tree to cover up their affair. This was a terrible choice of villain, since Butler is an uninteresting character, and he felt like the laziest, most obvious pick for the new murderer. This is another sad reminder about just how little this sequel cared about the horror elements, instead settling for a cliched multiverse storyline. A far better choice for the killer would have been one of the other students, especially Danielle, Tree's hilariously obnoxious sorority colleague. Prom Night, Alex. This Canadian slasher film is pretty mediocre, but it remains a reasonably well-known slasher flick. In Prom Night, a murderer attacks a group of teens who accidentally caused the death of a young girl, Robin, when they were kids and covered it up. If this sounds familiar, that isn't surprising, since this scenario is highly similar to the first act of I Know What You Did Last Summer. Ironically, while that movie had a good reveal of the main killer, this older depiction of a similar story fell flat with its villain. Prom Night's killer is Alex, the brother of both Robin and protagonist Kim. He'd witnessed his sister's death all those years earlier. Unfortunately, this reveal is highly unsatisfying. Alex not only barely appears, but seems too benevolent to be a killer, so him being the murderer feels highly contrived. As well as this, at the end, Jamie Lee Curtis's protagonist ends up killing her brother when he attacks her boyfriend, and the film ends with her crying over the death of another sibling. This ultra-dark ending felt wildly out of place in what was simply a trashy, low-budget slasher flick, and it was all just a bit much. Number 4. The Bone Collector. Richard Thompson / Marcus Andrews. When a serial killer movie reveals the secret identity of the killer, the response should be one of shock and astonishment. It should not be, wait, who's that again? Unfortunately, that was the case with this bland ripoff of Silence of the Lambs and Seven, which features a quadriplegic detective working with a street cop to catch a serial killer in New York. The serial killer who's kidnapping people in a taxi and killing them in some, in fairness to the film, genuinely shocking murders turns out to be some random character, Marcus Andrews, going by the fake name of Richard Thompson, who's appeared briefly in 2 other scenes as the technician who maintains the protagonist's medical equipment. This revelation doesn't work since it was such a minor character, while Andrews himself is simply laughable. He comes across as a whiny nerd instead of a depraved killer, and his motives, the protagonist wrote a report that revealed he'd planted evidence, thus landing him in jail, feel highly petty. With serial killer movies like this, there has to be a good twist at the end, and that was something this flick sorely lacked. Scream 3, Roman Bridger. Scream 3 is easily the worst of the otherwise consistent Scream franchise, and while the other 3 films all have awesome reveals of the killer's identity, in this case the big reveals sucked. The Ghostface killer here is Roman Bridger, the director of Stab 3, a film within a film based on the Ghostface murders in the prior Scream movies. Roman's an enormously uninteresting character who didn't even appear much throughout the film. In fact, some might not even recognize him when he's first unmasked. More irritatingly still, the big revelations that he's Sidney Prescott's half-brother, that he's seeking revenge because their mother never acknowledged him and also encouraged the murders in the original Scream, were a highly contrived and forced attempt to tie the 3 films together. It was just impossible to believe such a boring character caused the trilogy's events. Frustratingly, Scream 3 originally had a far better ending. The killer would have been a large group of teenage fans of the Stab films. Unfortunately, but understandably, this storyline felt rather insensitive since it was only a year after the Columbine High School massacre, so this ending was scrapped. Still, it would have been nice to see a better ending than this.
The Alien, 10 Cloverfield Lane. Now, many moviegoers went into 10 Cloverfield Lane assuming it would explain details revolving around the monster that appeared in the first film. Instead, the sequel focused on a young woman trapped in a bunker with a deranged man who claims that the surface world has been infected by a bioagent. Although viewers were disappointed and confused by this change of direction, 10 Cloverfield Lane gets away with it for the most part due to its compelling story, tight script, and phenomenal performances. However, the film throws a curveball during the climax. In the final scene, Michelle escapes the bunker just before it blows up. However, the explosion catches the attention of a nearby flying saucer. The ship veers in Michelle's direction before dropping an extraterrestrial right in front of her. Although there's nothing particularly terrible about the alien's design, it is completely forgettable. You may have enjoyed 10 Cloverfield Lane, but you probably couldn't actually remember what this creature bloody looked like. What makes this big reveal all the more infuriating is how unnecessary it all is. Why is there an alien all of a sudden? Even though the extraterrestrial's inclusion is sloppily handled, you could forgive the movie if it looked cool. Instead, this critter, well, it looks utterly generic. The Boogeyman. Boogeyman. Now, for centuries, there have been folk tales of a demonic entity who preys on the weak and the innocent. Depending on the culture, this being is known as the Puka, the Boogaboo, the Mumus, and the Bobo, which just sounds a little bit hilarious actually. But to many, this monster is simply referred to as the Boogeyman. Since this ghostly creature is known across the globe, it's no surprise that it's inspired several film adaptations, including a 2005 film simply called Boogeyman. Now, our story opens with a child called Tim witnessing his father being murdered by the titular monster. 16 years later, Tim finds himself unable to move on from his father's murder, encouraging him to learn more about the Boogeyman. Although Tim and his colleagues encounter the nebulous creature several times, we don't actually get a good look at it until the very end. But when the Boogeyman does finally appear, you can understand why he wasn't revealed sooner. Due to his janky movements and untextured CGI, it looks like the filmmakers just gave up halfway through animating this nefarious character. Because of how badly he turned out, it would have been more sensible if we never saw the Boogeyman directly, leaving his appearance to the viewer's imagination. The Creature, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Between the 50s and 70s, Hammer Films released 7 Frankenstein films, with Peter Cushing portraying the titular character. In each installment, the mad scientist creates a brand new creature to carry out his master's bidding. For die-hard fans, it was interesting to see multiple incarnations of the Frankenstein's creature, rather than sticking with the traditional square head and neck bolts design. And because Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell was the last entry in the franchise, you think that the filmmakers would go all out with designing him. But when the deranged doctor reveals his latest creation, you can't help but snigger. The creature, portrayed by Darth Vader himself, David Prowse, is covered in a shaggy fur, making him resemble Bigfoot rather than Mary Shelley's iconic character. The mask he wears is so shoddily put together, you feel like it's going to crumble off at any moment. And worst of all, his scalp is completely hairless, which kind of makes the creature look like he's had a nasty run-in with a barber. So instead of looking like one of the most legendary figures in science fiction, this creature resembles a balding gorilla, meaning that I could have bloody played him. Little Hal. Basket Case 3. Now, the Basket Case trilogy follows Dwayne and his former conjoined twin, and because his conjoined twin is a bodiless torso, Dwayne is worried that they'll never be accepted by society. Luckily, the pair are welcomed into Granny Ruth's home, where she cares for people with deformities who have been shunned by society. And even though these outcasts have got different physical appearances, we're reminded that Granny Ruth's son, Little Hal, has apparently got the most extreme deformity. Instead of showing Hal straight away, he's subtly teased for the next hour. In an early scene, the characters admire a painting of Hal as a baby, which depicts him with 6 arms. Although we see Hal several more times, his body is always obscured. And when a police officer bursts into Ruth's home to arrest her, the group reveal Hal to him, hoping his deformed appearance will freak him out. But instead of bearing witness to the scariest monster imaginable, all we see is a big blob wiggling his fingers. Also, it's obvious his extra arms are just stagehands, quite literally in fact. Worse still, Hal doesn't actually do anything. He doesn't attack the cop, he just stands there. Which kind of makes sense that he's meant to be just a person, right? But in terms of the film, where's the punch? The Spider. It. Now, because the It miniseries is 192 minutes long, it could have been an absolute slog. Fortunately though, you don't really feel the film's length thanks to Tim Curry's wonderful performance as Pennywise. Even though Curry plays up the nefarious clown's goofiest side, he never stops being creepy, which definitely keeps you on edge. As sinister as Pennywise is though, he warns the Losers Club how they have yet to see his true form. And when you hear these words, you can't help but wonder what truly terrifying form Pennywise will take on in the showdown. So when the Losers Club venture to Pennywise's lair to defeat him once and for all, they see that he is transformed into a giant stop-motion spider thing. Not only is the arachnid's movements janky as hell, it's obvious when the footage switches from stop-motion to an on-set puppet. And because Tim Curry isn't utilized after Pennywise turns into whatever the hell this is, the main villain lacks all personality and menace during this climax. Despite the fact that Pennywise's final manifestation is meant to fill us with dread, pretty much everyone thought the same thing whilst watching this scene. I waited 3 hours to see this? Come on. The Dark Seekers. I Am Legend. In I Am Legend, a virus has infected most of humanity, transforming them into a kind of vampiric race called the Darkseekers. One survivor, a virologist called Robert Neville, performs experiments in a desolate Manhattan hoping to find a cure. Even though we don't see the Darkseekers for the first half of the film, you're constantly reminded how dangerous they are. Although Neville tries to be clinical whilst making his reports, you can always sense fear in his voice when he describes the mutants' behavior. In early scenes, we actually hear them scuttling around and screaming, reminding Neville and the viewers that they're always nearby. But when you finally see the Darkseekers, everyone surely had the same thought, and this thought is usually then followed by, and also, why does the CGI look so bad? What makes the Darkseekers design more disappointing is how they could have just looked way better. Director Francis Lawrence originally intended the monsters to be brought to life using actors wearing prosthetics, but after seeing the screen test, Lawrence decided CGI was a better avenue. Despite the director's concerns, pretty much everyone thinks that prosthetic Darkseekers look vastly superior to their CGI counterparts, which makes you wonder why Lawrence swapped them in the first place. The werewolf, Cursed. Now, hair is amongst the hardest materials to render with CGI, so since werewolves are comprised of a bajillion follicles, they are an absolute nightmare to create digitally. The filmmakers behind Cursed were aware of this, which is why they hired Rick Baker to design the wolf beast. Since Baker coordinated the transformation scene in An American Werewolf in London, he was the perfect guy for the job. Sadly, the producers fired Baker, opting to bring the movie's villain to life digitally. Although the werewolf in Cursed never looks convincing, it looks exceptionally awful when Joni turns into a supernatural beast. Rather than editing this sequence in a way to hide the appalling effects, Joni's transformation is shown in a minute-long unbroken shot, which highlights every visual imperfection. The graphics are so rudimentary, you'd swear that you were looking at a cutscene from a PlayStation game. And what's worse is this scene takes place right in front of a mirror, meaning that we see the crappy metamorphosis from two different angles. Even though this scene was meant to be a standout moment, you just cringe from embarrassment and wait for it to end. The Giant Claw. The Giant Claw. To make a monster reveal as effective as possible, some films will ensure that the creature's appearance is kept secret from the public. However, the studio behind the Giant Claw took this practice to a whole new level. Although the poster showed the titular beast's body, its face was obscured. According to the lead actor Jeff Morrow, none of the cast knew what the monster looked like until the premiere. And although the Giant Claw is a cheesy B-movie, it builds up its monstrous star quite well, constantly reminding us of its terrifying size and power. But when you finally see this behemoth, you realize why it remained hidden on the posters. The filmmakers weren't trying to build up anticipation, they were hiding the creature because they were ashamed of how stupid it looked. Instead of looking like a traditional monster, the Giant Claw resembles a mohawk sporting turkey. What makes it funnier is how the human characters become paralyzed with fear every time this cross-eyed marionette appears. It's been reported that the premiere was a disaster, since the audience laughed hysterically every time the Giant Claw was on screen, and Jeff Morrow was so embarrassed by the crowd's reaction, he snuck out of the theater before the movie was even over. The Newborn, Alien Resurrection. Alien Resurrection is unanimously regarded as the nadir of the Ridley Scott franchise. This unnecessary sequel was let down by its jarring tone, unconvincing CGI, and cheesy dialogue. Because it focuses more on the action rather than the horror, it barely feels like it takes place in the same Alien universe. However, there's one factor in Alien Resurrection that really ticked off longtime Alien fans. Because the story centers around the creation of a human/xenomorph hybrid, the filmmakers had to design a new extraterrestrial called the Newborn. The scriptwriter, Joss Whedon, envisioned the creature having ivory white skin, hidden eyes, bulging red veins across its face, and spider-like legs. The Newborn was also meant to be colossal, rivaling the Queen in size, and even though this design sounds pretty terrifying, the Newborn was redesigned into a gloopy, saggy monstrosity that looks like it couldn't fight its way out of a paper bag. As bad as the monster looks, it could have also been so much worse. For some baffling reason, the Newborn was originally depicted having enormous male and female genitals. Thankfully, a studio executive had the common sense to convince the director to have the reproductive organs digitally removed. The Langoliers. The Langoliers. In the Stephen King adaptation, a group of passengers exit their plane only to discover that they've been frozen in time. Worse still, the passengers learn that they're at risk of being consumed by an interdimensional species called Langoliers. These cosmic beings' only mean of sustenance is time itself, compelling them to devour the universe of the past. Because of this, the passengers realize the Langoliers will eat them and the space they occupy unless they return to their timeline. Even though we don't see the Langoliers until the very end, they're described in great detail. We learn these organisms resemble hovering orbs with mandibles overflowing with fangs, and so you're expecting them to be the stuff of nightmares. Although the film is pretty boring by itself, you're urged to watch it fully just to get a glimpse of the titular villains. But when the Langoliers finally make their grand entrance, you wonder why you wasted your time. Simply put, these creatures make special effects from 1920s look like they're bloody Gollum. These monsters are so badly rendered you'd never believe that they're actually there. And despite the fact that the Langoliers could look scary, the badly textured VFX make them look like angry meatballs. Although the Langoliers design is sure to be something viewers never forget, especially when you consider that Rick and Morty definitely stole this design, it's not for the reason that the filmmakers actually intended.
The Hatbox Ghost, The Haunted Mansion. 2023's Haunted Mansion was among the biggest flops of the year, which is a major achievement considering the stiff competition. By no means terrible, this spooky remake was pretty bland thanks to the unambitious plot and cookie-cutter characters. However, nothing is as generically forgettable as central antagonist Alistair Crump, aka the Hatbox Ghost. Although there's nothing particularly awful about this sinister spectre's design, it's not much to write home about. Considering the Haunted Mansion is a huge Disney attraction and the Hatbox Ghost is a well-recognised character, fans assumed the House of Mouse could cook up something better than, well, this. The Hatbox Ghost from the theme park ride has more personality than this. Heck, the Hatbox Ghost from the Muppets Haunted Mansion looks better. Even though this villain seems like a character Jared Leto could really sink his teeth into, the 30 Seconds to Mars musician was given nothing to work with. As such, viewers have to wonder why he was cast in the first place, if the Oscar-winning actor's performance was going to be covered up with unconvincing CGI anyway. The Jangly Man, scary stories to tell in the dark. In this film, we see Stella and her friends discover an insidious book that manifests monsters into reality when read. Though Harold the Scarecrow and the Pale Woman are unsettling, the most terrifying creature is saved until the end. In the climax, Stella finds herself being hunted by the Jangly Man, an entity that can detach any of his body parts. By ripping off his arms, legs, and head, the distorted being can pass through almost any enclosure, making it nearly impossible to hide from. Sadly, the Jangly Man is let down by a trope everyone is sick to death of: excessive special effects. What's worse is the Twisted Beast could have been 100 times scarier if practical effects were utilised. Since the actor portraying the monster, Troy James, is a master contortionist, he was able to perform all the abnormal movements of the Jangly Man for real. Unfortunately, little of James's hard work can actually be seen, since it's slathered in overly stylised CGI. Even though the Jangly Man is creepy, he would have been pure nightmare fuel if the filmmakers kept things natural. Godzilla, Return of Godzilla. Even though Godzilla was initially depicted as a terrifying force of nature, the sequels revised the city-destroying lizard into a lovable hero who occasionally dances. Over time, Godzilla became a parody of his former self, encouraging Toho to devise a more serious installment called The Return of Godzilla. Although this entry was a decent attempt to reinvigorate the series, it failed miserably in the most important aspect: Godzilla himself. The cables in the dino's head malfunctioned, making it impossible for his eyes to face forward. The crew were unable to fix this issue, so the animatronic was stuck with his eyes facing opposite directions for the entire production. Due to this distracting blunder, nearly every close-up of Godzilla had to be removed from the American version. What makes this error more frustrating is how the other special effects are pretty impressive for the time, especially with the $6 million budget. The destruction of the city is top-notch. The 16-foot tall animatronic design for Godzilla deserves high praise, but every time the scene cuts to a shot of Godzilla's crossed-eyed stare, it's tough not to erupt into laughter. Queenie, Mother's Day. In Mother's Day, Trina, Abby, and Jackie venture into the woods where they're kidnapped by the deranged mother and her inbred children. At one point, Mother mentions how her deformed sister, Queenie, has survived in the forest for years by living off vermin. Since her sons have never seen Queenie, they wonder if their dear old mother made her up. That seems to be the case, since the boy's alleged aunt doesn't make an appearance. That is, until the very end. After Mother and her boys are killed, Trina and Abby breathe a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare is over. With little warning, Queenie leaps from the bushes and attacks the women, ending the movie on a freeze frame. And that's it. After being teased for over an hour, Queenie is only on screen for a few seconds. To be fair, Jason Voorhees was only glimpsed at in the original Friday the 13th and still managed to be terrifying. Queenie, on the other hand, is anything but scary. For the audience, it's annoying to wait so long for Queenie's reveal, and this is all they saw. Hugh Crane, The Haunting. CGI was all the rage during the turn of the millennium, encouraging filmmakers to stuff their projects with special effects. Although there's nothing wrong with incorporating computer-generated visuals into a movie, it becomes a problem when it's pointless, unconvincing, and relentless. Which brings us to 1999's The Haunting. Rather than using subtle horror elements like the 1963 version,
Manhattan, the remake relies on CGI to create unintentionally hilarious visuals, including frowning windows, screaming baby statues, and a door punching a woman. Even though The Haunting is a gold mine for poor visual effects, it saves the worst for the finale. In the last scene, the main cast are confronted by the ghost safeguarding the haunted mansion, Hugh Crane. Standing 50 foot tall, this colossal phantom should be wet your pants terrifying. But since Crane resembles a shadowy blob with an uncanny valley face slapped in the middle, this visual doesn't just look bad, but unfinished. The only redeemable thing about Crane's pitiful design is the fact that it distracts viewers from the scene's woeful dialogue. Jason Voorhees, Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. In each Friday the 13th entry, the audience expects to see machete-wielding maniac Jason Voorhees slaughter everyone in his path in brutal and creative ways. However, fans are also hoping to see something else, Jason's face. Although the zombie's visage has been seen several times, viewers are still curious to catch a glimpse behind Jason's mask, since he has a different design in each film. Even though Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan is garbage, some viewers stuck around to the end, hoping to see the titular villain's ugly mug. Sure enough, Jason's face is unveiled in the closing moments. And boy is this design awful. Lacking any facial expression, it appears as if the special effects team whipped up a facial covering in 5 minutes before shoving it on the actor's head. When Jason bashes into the wall, there's a close-up shot where it's painfully obvious his face is a mask. What makes Jason's appearance more anticlimactic is the fact that he looked fantastic in the previous installment. Friday the 13th Part 7 wasn't a good movie by any stretch of the imagination, but Jason never looked better before or since. Sadly, the same cannot be said about this Jason Takes Manhattan disaster. Zat. When horror fans hear a movie title like Zat, they're expecting some low-quality B-movie schlock, and yet this sci-fi indie turned out worse than anyone could have imagined. In this infamous dud, Nazi doctor Kurt Leopold is driven insane when his theories about fusing humans with aquatic creatures is, unsurprisingly, not taken seriously. As revenge, Leopold turns himself into a catfish hybrid, killing everyone who ever wronged him. With a measly budget of $50,000, it's no surprise Zat's monster looks like wet garbage. The costume is so shabby it had to be repaired on a daily basis, according to the writer Ron Kivett. As a result, Zat's appearance drastically changes scene by scene. But it gets worse. If viewers pay attention to the Zat actor's feet, they'll see him wearing tennis shoes in several shots. As god-awful as Zat looks, the way he's introduced is even more baffling. When this sea beast is revealed for the first time, an image of a catfish is spliced into the shot, despite the fact that Zat doesn't resemble the whiskered critter in any way. Which begs the question, why did the filmmakers make a movie about a catfish monster if they had no intention of making Zat look like one? The Demon, Amityville 3, The Demon. In Amityville 3, The Demon, paranormal debunking reporter John Baxter buys the haunted Amityville house, assuming its spooky reputation is unfounded. When supernatural phenomena occurs in John's abode and his daughter dies under mysterious circumstances, he begins to question everything he thought he knew. In the final scene, John, his estranged wife, and several paranormal experts venture into the basement, where they come face to face with a hideous demon. To be fair, this monster's design isn't half bad. It may be a little generic, but it could have been a lot worse. But there are two issues with how the demon is presented. Firstly, he reveals himself by popping out of a bubbling well. Even though this is meant to be a jump scare moment, it looks like the demonic being is chilling out in a jacuzzi. And secondly, the creature only appears for 10 seconds. After grabbing John's colleague, the demon drags him into the well, never to be seen again. Considering the film's title is Amityville 3, The Demon, it was assumed that the titular monster would play a more prominent role than a blink and you'll miss it cameo. The creature, Evil of Frankenstein. In the 1950s, Hammer Studios ushered in a new era of monster movies, remaking classics such as Dracula, The Mummy, and Frankenstein. Unfortunately, the Frankenstein saga ran into a problem straight out of the gate. Since Universal Studios owned the rights for the creature's design from the 1931 film, Hammer couldn't depict the iconic figure with his trademark green skin, square forehead, and neck bolts. As a result, the first two Frankenstein films had to settle with a much lamer version of the creature. But in 1964, horror devotees were overjoyed to learn that Universal had joined forces with Hammer for the third entry, Evil of Frankenstein. For the first time, Hammer could design Mary Shelley's iconic monster the traditional way. Against all odds, this incarnation presentation of the creature was a disaster. It's impossible to take this depiction seriously due to its smeared eyeliner and crummy makeup. The paper mache mask looks like it's going to slide off the actor's face at any moment. Even though there have been countless Frankenstein adaptations over the past century, Evil of Frankenstein might have the worst creature design of all time. Jellyfish monster, Sting of Death. Jellyfish are among the most feared animals on Earth, and with good reason. They look creepy, sting like hell, and are potentially lethal. For these reasons, a horror flick revolving around a jellyfish monster should have a lot of potential. However, Sting of Death well and truly botched that idea. In this 1966 creature feature, a deformed biologist is spurned by a woman, compelling him to transform himself into a jellyfish monster. At least it's supposed to be a monster. If it wasn't mentioned, viewers would believe that this creature is a man wearing a wetsuit and a trash bag on his head. Creases are visible around the arms and knees, indicating this monster is just a guy wearing a costume. Still, the most laughable aspect is the flippers. Rather than making the jellyfish monster's feet resemble tentacles, he wears ordinary swim fins. What's worse is the actor's heels and ankles are clearly visible on every close-up of the flippers. I mean, couldn't the filmmakers paint his feet black or give the actors socks so that they blended in with the costume at least? In hindsight, the only impressive thing about Sting of Death is how the actors got through every scene involving the jellyfish monster without laughing hysterically.
Brahms is a demonic spirit. Brahms, the boy too. Throughout the first Boy movie, it's presented that Brahms is a boy who died in a house fire 20 years ago, and whose spirit now resides within a porcelain doll. Of course, the big reveal of the movie is that Brahms is actually very real and very alive and has spent however many years living in the walls of his family's home. That made for a fun twist in what was admittedly a fairly fun horror film. So, when Brahms the Boy 2 rolled around, there was some mild anticipation that this could likewise be a decent offering. And then we get this sequel's big twist. Here, the final act twist sees that there is no adult Brahms lurking in the shadows, and instead the Brahms doll is indeed possessed by some sort of demon, as shown when the little porcelain son of a gun has his face smashed off and we see his real visage. Not only did this reveal ruin The Boy 2, but it also managed to take a giant dump on its predecessor. Nice one. The Cult of Thorn, Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. The title of this video could apply to numerous films in the Halloween franchise, but most fans' patience truly ran out by the time the sixth movie, Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers, was released. After Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers ended with Michael being sprung from prison by a mysterious man in black, Halloween 6 leapt forward 6 years to reveal that Michael was abducted by a cult called the Cult of Thorn. This cult is also revealed to be behind Michael's compulsion to kill, having given him a curse, that being the Curse of Thorn, which compels him to hunt down and murder his family members on Halloween night. This is head-smackingly stupid stuff, and precisely what you get when a horror franchise runs out of ideas but feels weirdly obliged to explain its monster's origins. And yet, wasn't the beauty of the original Halloween that Michael was an unexplained merchant of death? By demystifying him and doing so in such a profoundly idiotic way, this was tantamount to character assassination. Poor old Michael Myers. Lisa hallucinated her escape, 47 meters down. 47 meters down had one of those late stage plot twists that pissed just about everybody off. But if you actually did walk out of this film, you probably regretted it afterwards. So the film, it follows sisters Kate and Lisa, who end up trapped in a shark cage at the bottom of the ocean, with oxygen supplies dwindling and sharks circling them. At the end of the movie, Kate and Lisa seemingly manage to escape and get rescued from the water, before it's revealed that Lisa is actually hallucinating from nitrogen narcosis and is indeed still at the bottom of the deep blue sea. Oh, and her sister died during an earlier encounter with a great white shark. Quite the bummer. Just as the camera starts panning out and 47 meters down seems primed to end on an infuriating downer twist, Lisa actually is rescued by Coast Guard divers, and the film then abruptly ends. Writer-director Johannes Roberts evidently knew what he was doing here, but for anyone who just straight up turned off the movie once the twist was revealed, they missed out on the sort of happy-ish ending that followed. The Lipstick-Faced Demon, Insidious. Now, there are absolutely some brilliantly effective, chilling moments earlier in Insidious, most notably when the lipstick-faced demon suddenly appears behind Josh, totally out of nowhere in the middle of a scene. But that early glimpse of the demon only further proves the virtue of brevity in horror, because once we get a more prolonged look at the guy, he becomes near impossible to take seriously. In the film's finale, when Josh enters the purgatory realm known as the Further to rescue his son, we get a considerably better look at the lipstick-faced demon, who through repeated exposure makes his resemblance to Star Wars Darth Maul ever more clear. The often excellent James Wan bizarrely shoots the whole sequence here like a goofy funfair haunted house, which runs entirely counter to the genuine creepiness of the demon's fleeting earlier appearance. Black Goo Mind Control, Black Christmas 2019. 2019's Black Christmas Do-Over didn't exactly set high expectations from the jump, but plumbed such mind-numbingly stupid deaths by the end that it became an actual chore to finish the film. There are certainly worse ideas than updating a sorority-set slasher to confront contemporary issues like hazing and campus assault culture, but Sofia Takal's movie goes wildly off the deep end in its third act. It's eventually revealed that the murderous frat boys of Black Christmas are in fact being possessed by a magic black goo which pours out of a bust of the university's founder, Calvin Hawthorne, allowing his spirit to take control of the boys in order to murder troublesome women. Yep, that's a thing. It's a jaw-droppingly stupid revelation that forces the movie to collapse in on the weight of its own silliness, while also undermining anything serious a script might be trying to say about sexual assault at academic institutions. Magical black goo? Really? Could it not just be a cult or something? Except for the Cult of Thorn, of course. The director is The Killer, The Last Broadcast. The Last Broadcast is a mostly great found footage film, which suffered the bad luck of being overshadowed by a certain Blair Witch Project. It also doesn't help that the film, centered around documentary filmmaker David Lee investigating the murders of several men in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, concludes with an absolute clanger of a twist ending. And no, I too can't ever say the words Pine Barrens without not thinking of that magnificent Sopranos episode. Anyway, The Last Broadcast. David eventually receives footage that apparently contains the identity of the killer of this tale, and so he employs a data retrieval expert to reconstruct the damaged images on the tape. At this point, it's revealed that the killer is David himself, with the perspective suddenly shifting to third person. David then kills the expert and disposes of her body before continuing on with the next part of his documentary. The end. Clearly, the filmmakers here wanted to end things with a gotcha rug pull, but between the goofiness of this reveal and betraying the film's own rules with a sudden change of perspective, it brought an otherwise bone-chilling horror film to an utter dud of a climax. It's supernatural after all. The Last Exorcism. The Last Exorcism is a really solid found footage movie if you can forgive its over-egg shambles of a final 10 minutes. The movie revolves around down-and-out minister Cotton Marcus, who lets a documentary crew film what will be his final exorcism on a young girl named Nell Sweetser. Nell's father believes her to be possessed by the devil, having allegedly slaughtered livestock and miraculously fallen pregnant. But near the end of the story, Marcus realizes Nell isn't possessed at all. Rather, she's embarrassed about getting pregnant after sleeping with a local boy. But because the film apparently can't end there, there's one final twist. The boy in question is gay and hasn't had sex with Nell. Marcus promptly returns to the Sweetser farmhouse to find an occult ritual taking place, with Nell birthing a demonic entity. In the final scene, Marcus runs towards the ritual with a cross, his dwindling faith restored, while the filmmakers are all killed off by the family in the chaos. The more restrained ending, that Nell really was just a woman struggling to come to terms with her repressed sexuality, would have made for a far more interesting and unexpected finale, while the actual reveal ends up feeling like something the studio forcibly stapled on at the end. The CGI Darkness Monster, House on Haunted Hill, 1999. 1999's House on Haunted Hill remake has a solid cast and some genuinely excellent production elements, which apparently left nothing for the climax as the film settles for an abject eyesore of a final monster. The ending sees the remaining characters fleeing from a shape-shifting creature comprised of all the spirits in the house. Not a bad idea in theory, yet the VFX-based end result is ultimately horrifying in all the wrong ways. An amorphous digital blob that's not in any way scary, the creature's final form shoots for abstract but feels more sci-fi than anything. Even accepting the film's age, critics and audience alike dinged it for its god-awful VFX at the time of its release, and they were absolutely right to do so. For a movie that otherwise had a keen sense of style and atmosphere, this brought all of House on Haunted Hill's moody momentum slamming to a dead stop. Will, Ben's son, I still know what you did last summer. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer is a fun enough popcorn slasher sequel, even if it is clearly a low effort cash in on the original film's surprise box office success. But that final twist, it sure is something else, right? Near the end of this sequel, Julie's friend Will Benson reveals himself to be the secret second antagonist of the piece. More to the point, he's the son of Ben Willis, the fisherman who stalked Julie and her friends throughout both films by this point. To hammer this home for the cheap seats, Will points out to Julie that he playfully hid the truth in plain sight, given that Will Benson also means Will Benson. I see what you did there. Accepted as the campy schlocky cult classic it's been reclaimed as today, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer is a fun movie if you don't take it too seriously. But considering how straight-faced the film actually plays this reveal, it's one reveal which leaves most of us groaning on an initial viewing.